American Airlines Flight 4378 was heading steadily toward Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. It was supposed to be a normal evening flight, uneventful for the passengers and routine for the crew. There were dozens of passengers on board: businessmen, tourists, even celebrities. Among them was Keanu Reeves. He had planned this flight a few days ago, but something made him change his plans at the last minute. But no one suspected that in a few minutes the plane would be one step away from disaster. On approach to Washington, D.C., the controllers received an alarm signal. An unknown object appeared on the trajectory of the airliner. It moved chaotically and did not respond to calls. Seconds before the collision, the pilots did the impossible. And when the plane finally landed, everyone on board did not realize what they had just experienced. The engines hummed steadily as American Airlines Flight 4378 soared through the evening sky, cutting through the last hues of dusk. The city lights of Washington, D.C., twinkled in the distance, reflecting off the dark waters of the Potomac River below. Inside the aircraft, everything appeared routine. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, securing the cabin for landing. Some passengers sipped the last of their drinks, while others gazed out their windows, lost in thought. No one suspected that, in just a few moments, their fate would teeter on the edge of disaster. Among the names listed for this flight was one that stood out among the rest: Keanu Reeves. A planned business meeting in Washington had dictated his travel schedule, but a last-minute change in itinerary had kept him grounded elsewhere. A simple decision, one that should have been insignificant. And yet, as Flight 4378 neared its destination, that unmade journey would soon take on an eerie significance. The aircraft had been descending smoothly, following its assigned flight path with precise coordination from the air traffic controllers. The pilots, seasoned professionals, were in sync with their training, focused, methodical, unwavering. Their instruments displayed a seamless trajectory, their altitude and speed perfectly aligned with the approach pattern. All signs pointed to a textbook landing, until, without warning, something appeared on the radar. A blip, an unexpected presence on their screens. A moment of hesitation passed as they registered the anomaly. At first, it seemed like a mistake, an error in the system, a delayed response from air traffic control. But then it moved, fast, unpredictable, and heading straight for them. Within the span of a few seconds, the blip transformed into something tangible. Out of the darkness, a silhouette emerged against the glow of the city. Something large, something airborne, something entirely too close. It was a military-grade Black Hawk helicopter, positioned at an altitude it should never have occupied, appearing where it had no clearance to be. And yet, there it was, locked onto an unavoidable collision course. The cockpit, once a sanctuary of calculated calm, erupted into controlled chaos. Alarms blared, indicators flashed, and instinct overrode procedure. The pilots had only seconds to react. Air traffic control issued frantic transmissions, demanding immediate evasive action. The approach pattern had to be abandoned. Altitude had to be adjusted. But the proximity left little room for maneuvering. A fraction of hesitation could mean the difference between life and catastrophe. As the aircraft swayed from its designated path, the turbulence rippled through the cabin. Passengers clutched their armrests, oblivious to the unfolding crisis, their only indication of trouble being the sudden, unannounced shift in altitude. The city lights outside seemed to tilt unnaturally, casting eerie reflections against the windows. The Potomac stretched out below them, a dark void awaiting the outcome of this silent battle for control. The Black Hawk, moving with alarming speed, continued its unpredictable trajectory. Was it malfunctioning? Was there a communication failure? No response had come from its cockpit. The aircraft seemed unaware, or worse, indifferent to the impending disaster. And Flight 4378 was running out of sky. The pilots executed a desperate maneuver, banking sharply, cutting a path just beyond the helicopter's reach. The pressure inside the cabin fluctuated violently, triggering gasps and unease among the passengers. But the worst had not yet passed. The aircraft had evaded a direct collision, but the sudden shift had compromised the landing trajectory. Now they were coming in too fast, too steep, with seconds to correct their descent before the runway loomed ahead. Every calculation had to be adjusted on the fly. The instruments, though stable, had been pushed to their limits. The pilots fought against the gravitational pull of their own evasive action, wrestling the aircraft back into a controlled descent. The passengers, still largely unaware of the severity of what had just transpired, remained in tense anticipation. Their only sense of unease was the tightening grip of their seatbelts, the subtle shift in air pressure, the instinctual awareness that something had not gone as planned. The runway approached. Fast. The final moments demanded absolute precision. Every ounce of skill, every hour of training, every instinct honed over years of experience culminated in those final few seconds. The wheels struck the tarmac harder than usual, the force of impact reverberating through the fuselage. The brakes engaged at full power, the engines roared in resistance, and the aircraft hurtled down the runway in a battle against inertia. And then, silence. The aircraft slowed, its momentum dissipating as it finally came to a controlled stop. The passengers, shaken but unharmed, let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. The flight attendants exchanged relieved glances, masking their own tension with professional composure. The pilots, hands still gripping the controls, exchanged looks of silent acknowledgement. They had done it, barely. Outside, on the tarmac, emergency vehicles had already begun moving toward them, responding to the near miss that had been tracked by radar. The airport's operations team was in motion, demanding answers. How had a military aircraft interfered with a commercial flight? Where had the miscommunication occurred? And, most importantly, how had disaster been averted by mere seconds? As the passengers disembarked, unaware of just how close they had come to catastrophe, one thought lingered in the air. Among the names listed for that flight was a man who had missed it by chance. A man who, had fate played out differently, would have been among them in that moment. Keanu Reeves. The world had nearly lost him that night. And yet, he had never even boarded the plane. The runway lights cast long shadows on the tarmac as Flight 4378 finally came to a complete stop. The hum of the engines, once roaring with urgency, had diminished into a dull vibration, like the last echo of a narrowly avoided catastrophe. Inside the aircraft, passengers still clutched their armrests, hearts pounding, minds struggling to process the abrupt maneuver that had brought them safely to the ground. They were alive. That was all that mattered for now. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged exhausted glances. Their hands, still firm on the controls, twitched with the last remnants of adrenaline. They had followed every procedure, reacted with precision, yet the question lingered. How had that Black Hawk ended up so dangerously close to their descent path? Air traffic control had been equally blindsided. No clearance, no communication, just an unmarked military aircraft hovering too close for comfort. Something didn't add up. As soon as the aircraft doors opened, the cool Washington night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside. Emergency vehicles flanked the aircraft, flashing red and white beams across the fuselage. Airport security was already mobilizing, and air traffic control officials were en route. This was not going to be a simple debriefing. There would be questions, there would be investigations, and somewhere in the midst of it all, a truth waited to be uncovered. Keanu Reeves, meanwhile, was oblivious to the events that had unfolded. Across the city, he sat in a dimly lit hotel lounge, sipping on a glass of still water. His team had advised against a change of plans, but something had told him to delay his flight. He hadn't questioned it. He never did when it came to instincts. And now, an odd, creeping sensation settled over him as his phone buzzed with unread messages. Friends, reporters, even his agent. Something had happened, and it involved the flight he was supposed to be on. Across town, airport officials were gathering inside a secured conference room, staring at radar logs and flight data from the past hour. The Black Hawk had disappeared just as mysteriously as it had appeared. No identification, no transponder signal, no contact. The Pentagon had already been contacted, but their response had been vague at best. No record of a sanctioned operation in that airspace. No reports of rogue activity. Just silence. The pilots of Flight 4378 were led into a separate room, their post-flight debrief turning into a security inquiry. Their statements were concise. They had followed ATC directives, had visually confirmed the presence of the helicopter, and had executed evasive maneuvers with mere seconds to spare. But beyond that, they knew nothing. The incident had happened too fast, and now, all they could do was wait. Keanu's fingers hovered over his phone as he scrolled through the headlines. Near miss over Washington. Flight 4378 narrowly avoids mid-air collision was plastered across news feeds. Details were sparse, but the implication was clear. If he had been on that flight, he would have lived through it or not. The thought sent an unexpected chill through him. A moment of randomness, a change in plans, had pulled him from an event that could have altered his fate entirely. At the airport, federal agents had arrived. The TSA, FBI, and NTSB had converged, each with their own stake in the investigation. Witnesses were being pulled aside. Radar technicians were replaying data. And yet the central mystery remained. Where had that Black Hawk come from? And why had it been there? A sudden development sent murmurs through the control room. A technician, sifting through recorded audio feeds, had caught something, an anomaly buried within the static, a transmission masked under the usual ATC chatter. The message was faint, but unmistakable. Confirm hold at designated waypoint. No deviation. Repeat, no deviation. No deviación. But whose orders? The Black Hawk had deviated from whatever flight path it had originally been on. Had it been responding to something? Had its crew even been in control? The implications were unsettling. Keanu, still in his hotel room, set his phone down and exhaled slowly. He wasn't one for paranoia, but this was something else. Too many questions, too many loose ends. His flight should have been uneventful. Instead, it had become the center of a potential national security incident. Outside the airport perimeter, journalists and camera crews had begun to gather. The world was watching. Statements would have to be made, but the people searching for answers, pilots, controllers, federal agents, were nowhere near a conclusion. The night dragged on. Somewhere, someone knew the truth. Somewhere, files existed that would explain why an unidentified military aircraft had nearly collided with a passenger flight over one of the most secure airspaces in the country. But as of now, those answers remained hidden. And Keanu, unknowingly entangled in the mystery, was left with one unshakable thought. Had he just narrowly escaped something far bigger than a near miss? Washington, D.C. never truly slept. Even as the deep night settled over the city, the air buzzed with quiet tension. In the aftermath of Flight 4378's near disaster, the streets outside the airport remained restless. News vans lined the perimeter, journalists eager for scraps of information that had yet to materialize. Inside the terminal, the last of the shaken passengers filtered out, some meeting anxious loved ones, others heading straight to waiting cars, too overwhelmed to process what had nearly happened. The real questions, however, were being asked behind closed doors. The conference room deep inside the airport's control center was packed with officials, pilots, security personnel, and intelligence operatives. Radar logs and transcribed communication reports covered the long table, but none of them offered a satisfying explanation. The Black Hawk had disappeared from radar the moment Flight 4378 made its evasive maneuver. No record of where it had gone, no trace of emergency beacons, no reports of a crash or emergency landing. It was as if the aircraft had never existed. At the head of the table, an NTSB investigator rubbed his temples as he listened to a technician replay the garbled transmission again. Confirm hold at designated waypoint. No deviación. Repeat, no deviación. It wasn't a standard ATC instruction. It wasn't even meant for the commercial flight. But someone had issued those orders. And now, someone had to answer for them. Across town, Keanu Reeves sat in his hotel room, his eyes locked on the television screen. The news anchor spoke in careful tones, revealing only the information they had. There had been a near collision, an investigation was underway, no casualties, but the circumstances remained unclear. His name hadn't been mentioned, at least not yet. But he knew it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection. He had narrowly avoided being on that flight. A last-minute change of plans had kept him away. But why did he feel like there was something more to it? Something he wasn't seeing? He scrolled through his phone, looking at emails, texts, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when his instincts had told him to change his plans. There was no logical explanation, just a feeling, a quiet whisper of unease that had settled over him before he had made the call. It wasn't the first time his intuition had guided him, but it had never felt this precise. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, a separate meeting was taking place. A room filled with men and women in uniform, eyes locked onto the same grainy radar images that had been dissected at the airport. The difference was here they weren't looking for answers. They already had them. And now, they needed to decide how much of the truth they were willing to let slip. A general, his face unreadable, cleared his throat. We need to keep this contained. The moment this turns into a national security issue, we lose control of the narrative. We say as little as possible. A younger officer hesitated before speaking. Sir, the pilot of that Black Hawk. Have we confirmed? Not our concern, the general interrupted. It's gone. That's the end of it. The words settled over the room like a lead weight. But it wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. By morning, speculation had begun to spiral. Online forums dissected the radar anomalies. Conspiracy theories emerged overnight, painting wild narratives about secret government missions, rogue military operations, even extraterrestrial interference. But the truth, as always, was far more complicated. Keanu Reeves finally gave in and called his agent. He needed to know if anyone had reached out to the press about his intended flight plans. If his name was about to become part of the story, he needed to be prepared. But even as he waited for the call to connect, he couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was at play. The kind of thing that didn't just disappear overnight. Because somewhere out there, the Black Hawk still existed. And someone knew exactly where it had gone. And why. The early morning light filtered through the thick Washington haze, casting an eerie glow over the Potomac River. The city moved as it always did. Cars rushing over bridges, pedestrians lost in their routines. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The near disaster of Flight 4378 was still fresh in the minds of those who had lived through it. But for those in power, it was a problem that needed to disappear, just like the Black Hawk that had seemingly vanished into thin air. Inside the secured conference room at the airport, the investigation had entered a new stage. The FBI had taken over, sending their own analysts to go through the radar data, cross-check flight plans, and scrutinize every detail of the air traffic recordings. The more they looked, the more impossible it all seemed. The Black Hawk had appeared without a call sign, without clearance, and without any known mission. It had interfered with a major commercial flight, yet there was no emergency distress call, no Mayday transmission, no sign of pilot error. And then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it was gone. No wreckage, no tracking, no witnesses who had seen it land anywhere. Someone had wiped it from existence. Keanu Reeves sat in his hotel room, his laptop open in front of him, staring at a blank document. He had meant to jot down notes for an upcoming project, a new script idea he had been toying with for months, but his mind was elsewhere. The headline flashing on the news still gnawed at him. Near miss over Washington. Military aircraft mystery deepens. He wasn't one to dwell on what-ifs, but this one felt different. He had been supposed to be on that flight. The decision to change his itinerary had been instinctive, unplanned, but looking back, it unsettled him. He checked his phone. No missed calls, no urgent texts. His agent had reassured him that no one had linked his name to the flight. Yet, but he wasn't naive. Sooner or later, someone would connect the dots. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed into a search bar. Unidentified Black Hawk, Washington, D.C., January 2025. Nothing. No new reports. No eyewitness accounts. No leaked images. For an event that had almost ended in catastrophe, the internet was disturbingly quiet, as if the whole thing had been sanitized overnight. Across the city, inside the Pentagon, a private meeting was underway. The air was thick with unspoken tension as a handful of military officials, intelligence analysts, and a representative from the NTSB sat in silence, waiting for the briefing to begin. A high-ranking officer finally spoke. We are officially closing the investigation on the Black Hawk incident. No one reacted. No one was surprised. The officer continued. The official report will state that a routine military exercise encountered a momentary navigation failure, which was corrected before impact. No further action is necessary. The analysts exchanged looks. Everyone in that room knew it was a lie. Sir, one of them finally spoke up, hesitant. There's still the issue of the flight recording anomaly. Silence. The radar technician shifted in his chair. "We have audio that was buried under the static. A transmission, just a few words. It doesn't match any of the pilot's communications." The officer folded his hands. "What does it say?" The technician glanced at his notes, then looked up. "It says mission aborted. They saw us. Asterisk, asterisk." Keanu closed his laptop. His gut told him he wasn't imagining things. Someone had seen that Black Hawk. Someone had made sure it disappeared. But why? And more importantly, who was they? Keanu Reeves sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, the engine humming beneath him as the driver navigated the quiet streets of Washington, D.C. He had always trusted his instincts, but the deeper he dug into the mystery surrounding Flight 4378, the more uneasy he became. There were too many gaps, too many convenient explanations that led nowhere. And worst of all, there was no trace of the Black Hawk that had nearly caused one of the worst aviation disasters in recent history. He glanced at his phone, the same search queries glaring back at him, the same lack of results. It was as if the entire incident had been erased from existence, leaving behind only whispers and half-formed theories. But Keanu knew better. Something, or someone, was ensuring that the world forgot about what had happened. The question was, why? Back at the Pentagon, the meeting had ended, but the weight of its conclusion lingered. The transmission, asterisk, asterisk, mission aborted. They saw us. Asterisk, asterisk wasn't just an anomaly. It was proof. Proof that the Black Hawk had been there on purpose. Proof that it had been pulled away the moment Flight 4378's pilot spotted it. But even that wasn't the most disturbing part. Someone had covered it up before the world could ask questions. At the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent investigation had begun, though with limited access. Key pieces of data had already been sealed, radar logs overwritten with generic flight paths that showed nothing out of the ordinary. Even seasoned investigators were beginning to question whether they were chasing a ghost. Keanu's SUV pulled into the underground parking lot of a discreet government building. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket, and took the elevator to the 8th floor, where a dimly lit hallway led to a single unmarked office. He knocked once. The door opened just enough for a pair of cautious eyes to peer through before it swung open fully. Inside, a man in his late 50s sat behind a cluttered desk, stacks of classified files surrounding him like a fortress. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man muttered, motioning for Keanu to sit. Keanu studied him. Former intelligence, most likely. The kind of person who had seen too much but had been discarded when his usefulness had run out. The nameplate on the desk, simply Reed Barrett. "You were supposed to be on that flight," Barrett said matter-of-factly. "That's why you're here." Keanu nodded. There was no point in denying it. Barrett exhaled, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "What do you know so far?" Keanu hesitated. "I know that a Black Hawk appeared where it shouldn't have been. I know that air traffic control was blind to it until the last second. And I know that someone made sure it disappeared." Barrett nodded approvingly. "Good. But you don't know the real question you should be asking." Keanu narrowed his eyes. "Which is, who was on board that helicopter?" Silence filled the room. It wasn't something Keanu had considered. Not fully. He had been so focused on the event itself that he had overlooked the most crucial detail. The Black Hawk wasn't just a rogue aircraft. It was transporting someone. Someone important enough to rewrite the truth. Across the city, at an undisclosed location, a team of specialists sat in front of glowing monitors, watching and rewatching the limited footage they had been able to recover. The grainy images told a story that no official report ever would. A helicopter lingering in restricted airspace. A commercial flight forced into a maneuver that had defied the odds. A sudden retreat, not an accident, but an order. The pieces were there, waiting to be put together. And Keanu Reeves, whether he wanted to or not, was now part of the puzzle. Because the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized he wasn't the only one asking questions. And that meant he wasn't the only one in danger.